What's up YouTube, this is Dennis Panuta for tutorialsEU. In this video you are going to learn how to develop in C#. So you're going to learn the basics of C#, but not only that, you're also going to build your first program. And the program that you're going to build after this roughly hour or maybe 1.5 hours of video is going to be this program right here, which is just a very basic toolkit application which allows us to open up a browser tab for specific websites that I have defined here. So I can simply enter an option. For example, if I want to open up Google, I just enter G and press the enter key, and then a Google tab comes up. So in order to demonstrate it once again, I can enter G, and as you can see, a Google tab opens up. And that's a very basic program, but it already has plenty of different functionalities of C#. So you're going to learn all of those basics in this video, and you're going to build a final program towards the end. All right, so let's dive right into it and check out in the presentation what you are going to learn throughout this video. So different aspects and different chapters of C#. Hey, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. All right, so this video is all about C# and the C# basics, and we are also even going to cover basics of OOP, which stands for Object-Oriented Programming. So this video is completely for beginners, so if you have no experience in programming whatsoever, it's totally fine, because that's what we're going to cover in this video. And we're going to build this toolkit application towards the end, right? So what you will learn in this video is what you see here. So first of all, we will install Visual Studio, which is an IDE, an integrated development environment, which we need in order to develop. We could, of course, develop with other tools as well, but Visual Studio is the way to go, and it's the best IDE out there for C# development. Then you're going to understand the Visual Studio interface. So I'm going to cover that a little more. We're going to go into variables and data types. You are going to see what if statements are, which we pretty much need to do something if a specific condition is met, and do something else if another condition is met, or something completely else if none of the conditions are met. Then loops, arrays, for each loops, objects and classes and methods. So you see plenty of names and things that might not make sense to you. No worries, we're going to go into every single one of them in detail, in depth. I don't want to go into too much detail now because we're going to cover it throughout the video anyways. So let's dive right into installing Visual Studio. Quick pause. In this video, you'll learn something about C#. And if you want to learn everything there is to know that you need for the fundamentals and to become a real C# developer, then definitely check out my C# masterclass, in which you're going to learn all of the things you need to know about C#. So you're going to learn how to do the basics, how to use object-oriented programming, how to use WPF in order to create your own user interfaces, how to use databases, how to use LINQ, how to create your own games using Unity, and a lot more. So if you want to become a real C# developer, definitely check out the link in the description below. So let's go to google.com and search for Visual Studio 2017 download. And the first thing you'll find is visualstudio.com/downloads, and go to that website. On this side, you can download multiple different Visual Studio versions. And the one that is free is Visual Studio Community. It's free, fully featured IDE for students, open source, and individual developers. IDE stands for Integrated Development Environment, which means that this kind of software will reduce the amount of code that we need to write, because it will write a lot for us. It will compile, it lets us debug, it in general lets us create software in a much easier way than just to write a simple text file and type all the code in there and try to compile it by yourself. So these are just some features of Visual Studio which will make our life so much easier. So let's go ahead and click on free download, and that will open up this Visual Studio Community exe file. So I'm going to save that exe file and I'm going to install it. By the way, if you are not on Windows, if you are on a different machine, you can go here and choose Mac OS and then download it for Mac OS. But usually your browser should be smart enough to figure it out and show you the right download straight away. So I'm just going to go back to Windows, and then I download this Visual Studio Community exe. Once that is done, you can click on it and start installing it. So the Visual Studio installer will be opened up. And here you can read through the license term and the privacy statements of Microsoft. Once you're done with that, you can press continue. And it will download and install Visual Studio installer. Once the Visual Studio installer is installed, you can go ahead and install Visual Studio Community from here. In case you can't find the Visual Studio installer, you can simply press the Windows button and search for Visual Studio installer and open it up. And it should open up like that. On Macintosh, it's Command space and Visual Studio installer. So press Command space and search for Visual Studio installer. So just press on install and it's going to get things ready. Once you're here, you can choose which workloads you would like to install. And in my case, what I'm going to need is the Universal Windows Platform Development. So I'm going to press here. Then you can scroll down and you can take in several additional features that you would like to have. For example, if you want to develop with C++ and want to develop games, you can do that here. Or if you want to work with Unity, you can install it from here already. But do that later on once you're at the Unity chapter, because you will need a specific version of Unity in order to follow along the videos exactly as they are. All right, so for now, it's going to be enough if you just tick this check mark here, and then you can go to individual components. And here you will see what will be installed. So you can see there's Net Framework that's going to be installed for me automatically. And later on, we will install additional things as we will need them. So for example, later on, we will need link to SQL tools. If you want to, you can already install them straight away. And generally, we will add individual components as we go. If you want to develop in a different language, you can install language packages here. For example, in my case, I've chosen English, but you can choose all those languages that you have here and install it there.
Hey, don't forget to subscribe and like the video.
Once you're done with that, you can press on install and you can see here what the total size will be. And on the right hand side, you can even see a summary of all the individual components that you will install and the Universal Windows Platform Development that will be included. So you can see all of the different elements that are included. Then you have the optional ones, which you can choose later on, but I'm not going to keep it as it is. And you can even change the location here as well, of course. And once you've chosen the folder where you want to install Visual Studio, you can simply press install. And that will then start the operation. It will download all the relevant files and will install them as it goes. And that can take quite a while. So I'm going to pause the video until it's done. Once the installer is done, you will find that Visual Studio should start up automatically if the checkmark was checked. But if not, then you can launch it anytime. Once it is launched, you will find that it opens up with a start page where you see plenty of information about getting started, how to build your first app in 5 minutes, and so forth. And in my case, as you can see, it went from white to black, and that has to do with settings that I have. Then I have this recent area, which opens up all the different projects that are stored in a specific folder that is set up within Visual Studio. If you would like to change some settings, as for example the background color, you can go to Tools, Options, and there you will find different changes that you can make. You can change the font size, you can change the colors, you can even go to the color theme and change it here. So I have the dark color theme, which you can see here, which is this dark grayish color theme. You can have a light color theme, which will change it back to the default value, which is this very light theme that you can see here. And you can also have the blue theme. So you can play around with the themes and check the one that you prefer. I'm going to use dark again. By the way, the video that you're watching is just a fraction of what you can learn in the complete C# masterclass. There you learn everything about C# that you need to know in an almost 30-hour course. So check it out, link is in the description. Why would you even care about C#? Well, you probably have your own reason. Maybe you want to develop a game, maybe you want to become a C# developer and find a job, or you just have an idea for an app that you want to build with Xamarin. There are plenty of different reasons why you could care about C#, but I just want to summarize and show you the main reasons for C# in this video. So first of all, we have great OOP language, which pretty much means that C# is a great object-oriented programming language, which is the way to go in current times. Then it's backed by Microsoft, which means that it's backed by a huge company which is really invested in making C# an amazing programming language. So they're really working on improving it, and it's already a great language, but they're constantly improving it. Then it's used in many different areas. For example, in game development using Unity 3D. And Unity 3D is just one example. There are plenty of other tools which also use C# as the basis for game development. And yeah, Unity is just the most popular one. Then we have PC programs. We have mobile apps using Xamarin, and then you can develop web apps, web services, Internet of the Thing apps, and mobile backends with ASP.NET. What ASP.NET is not something that you should be concerned about. Same with Xamarin or Unity. These are pretty much just tools which extend the functionality of C# and allow you to develop programs of specific types. So they use certain libraries which allow you to use their code in order to develop something. So you can pretty much use interfaces that they have developed, which can make your life as a developer a lot easier. Now, you as a beginner will probably not use ASP.NET, Unity, or Xamarin straight from the start. You first of all need to understand the C# basics. But once you're there and you have decided what you want to do with your skills, then you would focus on one of those areas and would become really good at it.
Hey, don't forget to subscribe and like the video.
A good thing about C# is that it's actually quite easy to learn. So it's one of the easier programming languages, I would say, and it's very user-friendly and easy to learn. Then we have the big community, which means that there are loads of tutorials, Q&As, and so forth. So if you have a question, there probably is an answer online already, which is very useful as a developer, because it's super frustrating if you can't find an answer for an issue that you have and you have to search for it for hours and hours. And that's something that doesn't happen that often with C#. Then we have many job openings. So there are plenty of jobs or plenty of companies searching for people who are great C# developers. So that's a great reason for you to, of course, know the skill as well, or acquire the skill. All right, so now let's create our first little project. And in order to do so, we can either go ahead and create a new project from here, create new project, or we can go to File, New Project. So in case the start page isn't open in your case. All right, so here we can select many different types of projects to start with. So the one that I want to work with is this console app, because we're going to use exactly that, a little console app with the net.core. Once you have selected the console app, you can give it a new name. You can call it however you want. Console app 5 is fine in my case, because this is just going to be a helper project in which I'm just going to explain the basics to you. And then we are going to apply those in a different project to the actual app that we want to build, or to this actual program that we wanted to build, which is this toolkit application. All right, so now let's get started by pressing OK, and then this little program is being created. As you can see, there are plenty of different areas in here, loads of buttons, and the ones that are relevant for us now is the Save button, this Run button, then this tab here, which contains all of our code. The Solution Explorer, yes, but not so much. So this Solution Explorer really makes sense as soon as you have a bigger project. So as soon as you have multiple different classes, files, methods, and so forth. And you might not even know what all of these things are. So no worry, we are going to cover those words and also those concepts throughout the video. All right, so here you have the Solution Explorer, which pretty much contains all of the files of your project. And in here, you could even go as far as jumping to specific parts of your program. So you could see that as being your index, and you can just jump around between your chapters, so to speak. Then we have at the bottom, we have the properties, which we're not going to cover in this video. So properties are a different topic, which are a little more advanced than just the basics. And at the bottom, we can see this output tab, and yeah, we can pretty much drag everything around. As you can see, you can position things somewhere else if you want to. You could put it at the top, you could put it to the side, and so forth. So you can drag everything around, and there are more windows that you can use. So not just the one that we have here. You can create your own window layout and save that and so forth. But as a beginner, it's not that relevant. That's why we're not going to go too deep into that. But what is important now is what you can see here, and that is our code. So there is this file called program.cs, and the CS ending stands for C#. So we have the C# file, which has the name of program. Now, if you want to learn more about the file and how it looks in your Explorer, you can open it in a file explorer. So here, open folder in file explorer, and you will see that by creating this console app 5, we have a new project within our projects, and there is this SLN file, which is this Visual Studio file, and this is pretty much our project file. So if we double click that, it opens up our project. But then in here you see the different parts of our project. So we have this program.cs, and you can open it up in other programs as well. So for example, I could open it up in Notepad, and I could see the same code here. So that's what Visual Studio pretty much does. It opens this file, and we can edit this file and compile it anytime. All right, so there are more folders in there. There are plenty of files, and they simply take care of what should happen once our program is executed and when it is compiled. So compilation or compiling is a term that you might not know. It's basically taking this code and converting it into a program. And if we run this button here, that's exactly what we do. So if we press run, our code gets compiled, and then our little hello world program starts. Now, if you press this button, then a little window comes up and it disappears straight away. As you can see, .NET Exe has exited with code 0. So the program has started, but it has closed straight afterwards. And that's because this hello world is being printed onto the console, but there's nothing else happening. So what happens is our program starts, and we are in the main method. So this is the main method. It's called main. That's why I'm calling it the main method. That's pretty much the starting point of our program. So in here, our whole program starts. And if nothing is in here, then nothing will happen. So we could have loads of code somewhere else in our project, but if the main method is empty, then nothing will happen. So in here, we are going to develop most of our stuff for now. And we're going to start by typing console.read.
Hey, don't
key.
forget to subscribe and like the video.
And then the brackets and semicolon. So what happens here is that we say, okay, there is this class called console, and it has a method called read key, and I would like to call this method. Now, if you don't know what classes are and what methods are, that seems quite heavy already. But it's nothing that should bother you for now, because the only thing that you need to know is if you want to write something on your console, you use console.writeLine, and then you type the text that you want to use within the brackets and within the quotation marks. And then you end this statement with a semicolon. And as you can see, I ended the statement also with a semicolon where I say read key. So now my console is waiting for me to enter a key before it can go on. So if we run the code now again, what we will see is that my console, so this little program here, this is the console, and this finally makes sense what we have here. So this console has the statement here saying hello world. And as you can see, this little white dash which blinks here is waiting for me to press a key. So once I press a key, as you can see, my program closes. That's because this is the last piece of code within my program, and afterwards there's nothing happening, so it just shuts the program down. And now for you as a little challenge, please go ahead and change hello world to hello and then your name, and then run the program. All right, I hope you tried it. So here I would say hello Dennis, or I'm just going to type in hello Dennis, and my program should now show hello Dennis. Perfect. So as you can see, this is our first little program. It doesn't do much, it just displays some text, but we're going to need displaying text in our final project anyways, right? So it's good if you get used to using this write line, at least for console projects. All right, so now we have written our first little code. I would like to look at the structure that we have here. So we have a namespace here called console app, which is our app. It's pretty much our program, and it starts with curly brackets afterwards. So this is the part where it says, okay, everything that is within my curly brackets is part of my namespace. Then we have this thing called a class, and this class is called program. So we have our own little class, which is called program. And again, curly brackets. So everything that's within those curly brackets is part of our class. And we are going to see what classes are later on when we start with OOP, so object-oriented programming. So no worries for now. Then we have this static void main, and this is our main method. We are going to look into methods a little deeper later on as well, then this will make a lot more sense. But methods are basically a piece of code which summarizes multiple lines of code which will be executed once called. So once this main method is called, this code will be executed. So anything that we type in here will be executed. Then for now we only have these 2 lines, but later on we will add a lot more. And this main method, we never call it manually, but because it is the main method, it will be called by our program itself. So once the program starts, this main method will be called. And there is only one main method per program, so you cannot have multiple main methods. Then there is this string args, and that's something that we're going to cover later on. It's just there are certain information which are handed over once this main method is called, so once it is executed pretty much. By the way, the video that you're watching is just a fraction of what you can learn in the complete C# masterclass. There you learn everything about C# that you need to know in an almost 30-hour course. So check it out, link is in the description. I'm going to teach you the data types and variables in C#. So pretty much the process of storing data in C#, and you do that by using variables. Let's dive right into it. So first of all, we have an example here. So what you can see, we have a class which is called lecture, so the general structure that we had used before. Then we have this int age, which is a variable, and we assign a value of 15 to it. So what we're using here is a basic variable called age, which is of type integer. So we use the keyword int or int. And this indicates that this is going to be a whole number. So a number between 0 and multiple millions. So a pretty big whole number. It can be positive or negative. Then we have this public static void main, so the main method. And in here we have a console write line statement which will simply print something on the console. And then here we are using this age variable, so the variable that we had here. Now at this point here we assigned a value of 15 to that variable age. So whenever we are using age now, it will be the same as using 15. So in this case the output will be 15. Let's extend that code a little bit here. So in this case, when we declared the variable, we assigned a value of 15. But now within the main method, before we are actually using the age variable, we assign a new value to it. So now we assign the value of 20 to it, and suddenly age is going to be 20. So 15, which we had before, is not stored in age anymore. At this point where the write line method is called, age will be printed and age will be 20. Now let's have a next look here. What we see here is that we don't assign any value to age. And in C#, that pretty much means that age will simply be 0. So there will be the default value assigned to it, and that is 0. So it will not be empty like in other programming languages. It will simply have the value of 0. And then if we use age now, even though we have never assigned a value to it, it will simply output 0.
Hey, don't forget to subscribe and like the video.
When we create a variable inside of a method, so if we create it, for example, within the main method here, as you might know, this is a method. So this public static void main is a method, and it is the main method, which pretty much means that this is the starting point of our program. Now, if we create a variable in here now, which we do here in this example, then this variable can only be used within that same method. So we cannot use it outside of this method. Anywhere else, this variable will not be known, and we will get an error if we use it. So that's something that you have to consider. This is called scope, and it pretty much says that if you create something within a method, then you cannot use it outside of the method, but you can use it within the method. But then there is more than just this int data type. And we're going to look into multiple different data types now in this video. So let's check it out. Primitive data type sbyte. So sbyte, in this case, we say we create a variable called x, and it's going to be of type sbyte. And we assign a value, let's say 120 to it. Now, sbyte is a short byte, which is a very, very small piece of data. And it will only require very little storage. And it will simply store whole numbers from -128 and 127. So it will in total be able to store 256 different values. And that is because the 0 has to be stored in there as well. So you see, sbyte is very small, but it can also only contain very small numbers. Now we have the short primitive data type. So it's another data type. And here you can see we assigned 30,000 to it. We simply use this short keyword for it, and you can store whole numbers between 32,767 negative to positive. So already quite a bigger amount of numbers that you can store here. And of course you will require more space. And this is really not a problem nowadays if you're writing PC programs, but it can be an important performance boost if you reduce the data type, or if you use the smallest data type that you actually need for the software to do what it should do. Okay, then integer, and we have used integers already. You simply use this int keyword, and here we assigned a big value. So this is 2 billion, and it can pretty much store whole numbers between -2 billion, 147 million, and so forth to the positive value. The only difference is that here it's 648 and here it's 647. So again, the 0 is in there. And yeah, that's pretty much the values that you can store in an integer, and it will be enough in most cases. But if you want to store very long numbers, then this will not be the right fit for you. So then you will have to use a different data type. All right, then you will have to use the long data type. You can see long can store a very long number. So I'm not even sure what number this is, but it can store a whole lot of longer numbers. As you can see here, -9 billion to 9 billion. So that's pretty much the number that you can store in here. I'm not even sure what the term for billion is, but that's what you can store here. Then you have to ask yourself, when should you use sbyte, short, integer, long? Well, simply use the smallest data type your value fits into. Now, it is a lot easier than in reality it might be. So if you already know what kind of value might end up in a specific variable, then it's easy. Then you can simply already decide which data type it will be. But if you get the data from somewhere else, let's say user input, or you get it from a database, then you have to be very careful and thoughtful about the data type that you use, because then using a too small data type could end up in a problem, could end up in an error. So if you know what kind of value will be stored, then use the smallest possible data type. But if you don't know what kind of value it will be, then be flexible and try to use a bigger data type. All right, so there are other data types as well, because we have only looked at whole numbers now. But what if we want to store a floating point value inside of a variable? Well, then we can simply use this float data type. And as you can see here, we have just assigned 99.99. And here, as you can see, there is an f in there as well. So whenever you want to use a variable which is of type float, you need to add the f. If you don't do that, then the value will be considered as a double. We will look into double in a second. This allows decimals and a range from 1.5 times 10 by the power of -45 to 3.4 times 10 by the power of 38. So there is a 7-digit precision here. So if you need more precise decimal values, then float will not be enough for you. Then you should consider using a double. So you can see the double pretty much allows decimals and an even higher range than the float. So here you can have a 15-digit precision. That pretty much means that if you, for example, have the floating point at the 7th position, so you have 6 values on the left, then the floating point, and then you want to store, let's say, 10 values on the right, you can't do that. You can only store 8 values on the right then, because you only have a 15-digit precision. Now, if you need even more precision, you can use the primitive data type decimal, which allows decimals and an even higher range than the double data type. So you can see here 28-digit precision. So you can be very precise, can use very big numbers, but at the same time, decimal is a very big data type in terms of storage. All right, so when would you use float, double, or decimals? Float is mostly used in graphics libraries where you have a high demand for processing powers. So let's say you're developing a game, then you would most of the time use floating point numbers because the precision is not as important as the performance. And using bigger values in terms of bigger data types will reduce the performance. So there's a lot more to calculate, it takes longer, and that will kill your performance. That's why in video games, float is a very important data type. When you create video games with, for example, Unity or Unreal Engine, then float is the type to go. Double is mostly used for real world values, except money calculations. So if you want to use money calculations, then you should definitely use decimals, and it's mostly used in financial applications. So where you really need a very high level of accuracy and where even the 15th value behind the decimal point is important. All right, so that's something where you would use decimals. All right, now let's have a look at the Boolean data types. So there are even more primitive data types. Boolean is one of them, and if you want to create a Boolean value, you simply use the bool keyword, and in this case the variable is called switch. Now we have assigned something which is not a number, but which is the keyword false. This pretty much means that this bool will be false, this switch bool, and it can only have 2 values. So it can either be true or it can be false. So it's like a switch, it can be active or inactive. Now there is a try-state kind of thing where the bool could be empty, but in C# it's pretty much set to either one of the other. So that's pretty much it. It really allows only 2 values, and it's super powerful if you want to make sure that something is true or false and only do something if a specific condition is met. And that's something that we are going to cover later on in the course. All right, now there is this data type char, which stands for character, and it's used for one single character. So you can only store one character in there. And in order to assign a char, you need to use apostrophes here. So single apostrophe. So not the double quotations, but really single quotations here, super important. So it only allows a single character, literal or Unicode. All right, the next one is a string. So if you want to store text values, then you should use the string keyword. In this case, we have a username, which is, for example, Jason 1995, and it just allows multiple letters and Unicodes within one single variable. And a string can be very big, so you can store loads of data within a string. So as you can see, a string can store a combination of letters and numbers, but it will always be stored as text. So it will never be stored as a number. That's something that's very important to keep in mind. All right, so now let's start coding.
All right, so now that you know how variables work in general, so how they are basically working, let's go ahead and create our own variables. And therefore, just a little exercise for you: create a variable which is of type string, which should contain your name. And yeah, just go ahead and do that. All right, so let's do that. String name, and I'm just gonna call this one Dennis. So I hope you got that one right. If you didn't, no worries. That's what this course is for, or this video. You are supposed to learn this here. So first of all, we have this keyword string, which just says, okay, I want to have a text. So it says represents text as a sequence of UTF-16 code units. So it pretty much just means that it's a combination of multiple characters, and that's exactly what text is. So it's multiple characters in a string. So that's what this string word does. And then we have this name called name.
So this is the name of my variable. It could be anything else. I could say something like first name, and the value is Dennis, or whatever you have entered in here, or your name is. So we have this equal sign, which just says, okay, I want to store whatever is on the right hand side of the equal sign. I want to store this information, this value, within this variable, which is called first name. And we have to say that it has a specific type. So in this case, it has this type called string. All right, so now what we can do is, instead of just saying hello Dennis in here and have the name hard-coded, we could change it to being hello first name. So now if we run the code, we will still receive the same result. So our program will still say hello Dennis. Now we can of course change it to, for example, Frank. So now let's run it again, and we see it says hello Frank. So what this variable pretty much does is it just stores a specific value and we can use it. But it's important, it's only stored during runtime. So it's only created during runtime, and it's only available during runtime, or even more precisely, it's only available during its lifetime within the program, which has to do with scope. So as soon as we are outside of the main method, it wouldn't be available anymore. Now what we do in this line here is we declare and initialize the variable. So what we also could have done was something like string name, and then name is equal to Francis. So we could have done that as well. So in here we declare the variable, and here we initialize the variable. But we can also do that within one line, and that's exactly what we did here. So we declare it and initialize it in the same line. And as you can see, you can change the value afterwards. So that's the idea behind variables. They can be changed later on. For example, here my first name is the one that we use in this right line. Now, if I decide to change the first name later on, I could change that to Sissy and run it again, and now it will say hello Sissy instead of hello Frank. So whatever was entered before doesn't matter anymore because we have overwritten the value. So now what we of course also can do is not just create strings, we can also create integers which are used for whole numbers. So let's create an integer called num1, which is a short version for number 1, first number. And it should have the value of 13. And then I'm going to create another variable called num2, which is going to have the value of 25. Now what I can do is I can apply the basic mathematical operations on it. So I could store them in a result variable. So I'm going to say int result is equal to, for example, num1 plus num2. Now a little challenge for you. Please change the text that is printed onto the console from hello first name to the result is, and then I would like to see the result.
Hey, don't forget to subscribe and like the video.
All right, I hope you tried it. So the result is, and then here we're just going to use result. All right, so now let's try it again and see what we get. And we see the result is 38. Now we just added two values here. We can of course also apply multiplication here. So multiply those two values together and we will get 325 as a result here. So the result is 325. So that's a very basic use of variables. And of course we could also create variables which have a floating point value. So in order to do so, we can either use float. So I'm just gonna call this fnum1, so float number 1, and it's going to be 13.37. Now if I do that, I need to add the f in order to tell my compiler that this is going to be a float value, because otherwise it thinks it's a double value. Because what you can also do is you can create a double variable. I'm going to call it dnum1, which is going to be 15.3, and here I don't need to add the f or the d. That's just what C# and other programming languages do, that they say, okay, if it's a floating point number, then I'm just going to use it as a double value.
But if you want to use a float instead, you will use the f, or you have to use the f at the end of the value. Now, this might look a little confusing for you as a starter, but just remember, floats are less precise, but require less storage. So they are more performant. So if you don't need a very precise floating point value, then a float will be totally sufficient. If you need a very precise value, then you would use double, because that gives you a lot more precision. But most of the times we don't need this type of precision. So only in some real world applications you will need doubles. Usually, for example, in physics or in video games, you would use floats because they're a lot more performant, because there is a lot less space required and also a lot less calculation for your processor. All right, so I'm going to get rid of this double. And in order to do so, I'm just going to comment it out. I don't need this double value here. I just wanted to use a float, so I'm going to put it on top here like that. Now the second float is going to be just 5. I can also use just a whole value in here. I can store a full value in the float. And now I can do some calculation. Result is going to be f num1, and this is going to be f result, because now this is a float result, f num1 divided by f num2. And by the way, they don't have to be called f num or f result or something like that. You can call them whatever you like, but they have to, of course, follow certain rules. So you cannot use specific characters in here. So you cannot use some characters like this, as you can see, no paragraph characters, no modulo characters or percentage and so forth. So you have to use the characters that are allowed, and it's just alphanumeric values that you can use here. And you can't use numbers at the beginning of the variable name. So you cannot say one f result, but you can say f result 1, for example. All right, so now let's print out the f result just to see what's happening. And as you can see, we get the result of 2.674. So that's 13.37 divided by 5. There is one more important thing that I would like to show you, one more important data type, and that is going to be the Boolean. So in order to create a Boolean, you just use this bool keyword, and it's a data type that can only have 2 values. So it's either true or false. So I can say is sunny, and then I can either store true or I can store false. So only those two are possible. And then as you can see, I have entered false now, because if I look outside, I don't see the sun. So I'm just going to say it's not sunny. And you can use Booleans for other applications as well, of course. And we're going to see multiple ones in this video. All right, so now that we have all of this done, let's go ahead and save our project and go to our other project. So we want to have this specific project where we create our own toolkit application. And that was the one that I was talking about at the beginning of the video. And in order to add it, I will open up Visual Studio a second time. So I need to launch the Visual Studio, either the installer or Visual Studio once again. So a second version of it. And here I can see, so just say launch. And in my case, I have 3 Visual Studios open now, and that's not a problem. So as you can see, the project in the background is still there, the one that we were using, this console app. But now we are also building our little toolkit application. So what I'm going to do is create a new project. And in here, I'm going to go ahead and call this one toolkit app. And it's also going to be a console app. I press OK. Now, we aren't too far in our progress yet in terms of the basics of C#, but we have variables already. So what we can do is we can start to tell the user what he's supposed to do. So if we look at our program real quick, that's the one that we want to have in the end. So simply write the key and press enter. And what we have here is options, FGY, and then your option. So these are basically the information that we want to display to the user. And now let's have a look at how we do that. And let's just type it out for now. You know how to display something onto the console. You don't know how to use line breaks yet, but we will do that now. So let's start right now. In here we have this console write line, and it should not say hello world, but it should say something like simply write the key and press enter. We could also say type the key or press the key, but that's nuances. Next, we want to have options as we see here. All right, so same thing here, console W or CW, double tap, and that will give us this console write line. So you can type it out, but CW double tap will pretty much enter it automatically. Now the next thing is we write here options. And then in the next line we had Facebook, Google, YouTube, and they had some additional distance. So as you can see, there is a little tab here. They're not just below the options, but there is a little distance. All right, so let's try that. So again, CW. And in order to create this tab, I can use \T. And once I did that, I can enter my options. So for example, we had F for Facebook, and I'm just going to copy this because I need it multiple more times. So G for Google and Y for YouTube. And here we could even write it correctly if we wanted to, so with capital letters. And then in order to keep our program open for now, we also want to get the user entry. So it's not going to be console write line, but read. Before we used read key, but now we're going to use read line. So you can see that that is a very good advantage of using Visual Studio, because if I enter console dot, it gives me all of these options. And these options are either methods, such as write line is one, such as the main is one, or it gives me properties, but we're not going to go into properties for now, okay? That's something that is going to be covered in my whole course, which you can find in the description or a link for it. So in here, I will read the line because I want to read a whole line from the user and not just some very basic text. I want to read the whole line from the user and not just one keystroke, okay? Now, if I do that, if I run this application, you can see that it already shows these information. So it's very similar to what we have here. And here we have this additional one which says your option. But before I show you how this works with one keystroke and how you can enter and those kind of things, I would like to basically explain to you how you can get the user entry and use it in your program. All right, so what we're going to do is we are going to read whatever the user has entered here. So we need to stop our program and we want to store it in a variable. Now the entry of the user will be stored in a string. So I'm going to call this one user input, which is going to be console.readLine. Now I can go ahead and show what the user input was like this. Okay. Now I need another console read in order to keep the program open. But if we do that now, what we can see is the following. So let me enter something, and you can see user input was something. So whatever I had entered here was stored in a variable and then printed onto the console. So that's what I've done with these two lines. All right, so this is just the start of our little toolkit app. I'm gonna save that and go back to a presentation. Now that you know the basics of variables, it's time to look at something called if statements. And if statements are a very powerful tool, which you will need pretty much for every program that you're going to build. And in this case, we will need it for our little toolkit application as well, because depending on what the user has entered, we want to run a specific code. So for example, if the user has entered F, we want to open Facebook. If he entered G, we want to open Google. If he entered Y, we want to use YouTube. So that's very basically what we need to use this if statement for. And let's have a look at the theory before we go into practice and actually use if statements. All right, so first of all, we have the basic statement here.
the if statement executes a statement if a specified condition is true. If the condition is false, another statement can be executed, but doesn't have to be. Then let's have a look at a particular example. We can check if a variable equals something. So in this case, we check if the input that the user has given equals hello. And if that's true, then some code can be executed. If it's not true, then something else could be executed. So in this case, we have this variable called input, which we derive the value from the user. So the user enters something and it will be stored in input. In the next line, it will be checked. Is input equal to hello? Now here we use double equal signs. Double equal signs are used for comparisons. Single equal signs, as you can see here, are used in order to set a value to a variable. All right, so if this condition here is true, so if the user has entered hello, then those curly brackets, whatever code is within those curly brackets, will be executed. If it's false, then it will not be executed. We cannot only check for strings, we can also check if a variable of type integer or float or Boolean or whatever we can come up with meets a specific condition. So in this case, if the number variable has a value that is greater than 3, then the code within the curly brackets will be executed. In this case, it will not be executed because number is 1. So the code, whatever we would enter here, would not be executed. Now in this example, we have the AND operator, which allows us to check multiple conditions at the same time. And only if all of those conditions are true, then the overall condition will be true, and only then the code will be executed. So in this case, we check if the number, or if the variable number, is greater than 3 and smaller than 10. Only if both of those things are true, the code within the curly brackets will be executed. So pretty much only if the value is between 4 and 9 included. So in this case, this is not true, so the code would not be executed. What if we want to check multiple conditions, but only one of them has to be true? Well, then we can use the OR operator. So let's say we have this number, 23, and if number is bigger than 3 or is equal to 1, then the code will be executed. So in this case, if the code is 1, the code in the curly brackets would be executed, or if it's anything that is higher than 3, then the code will be executed. Now we have also something called else, which allows us to execute some code if the condition is not met, or if none of the conditions are met, and that will make sense as soon as we look at the next example. We have this number which has the value of 1, and we check, is number greater than 3? If number is greater than 3, then execute the code within my block. If not, then go to this else. And in the else, you have this little block here, and that will be executed if the conditions preceding were not met. So in this case, if the conditions before the else are not met. And here it's actually the case, because number greater 3 is not true. So we run into this else case, and we see the code within those curly brackets will be executed. What if we want to check multiple conditions, but also execute specific code for each of the conditions? Then we can use else if. So here we are checking if number is greater than 3. And if it's not greater than 3, we are checking if number is equal to 0. And if it was 0, then the code here would be executed. But because none of the two conditions are met, none of the code will be executed. Now that's what we need this whole combined version for, where we have a variable called number, which has the value of 23. We check, is it greater than 3? Well, yes, that's the case. So this code here will be executed. Now we would check, is the number equal to 0? And that's not the case. So this code will not be executed. And if none of the above were true, then this code here, this else code, would be executed. But as the very first condition here is already met, so number is greater than 3, this code will be executed. And that's something that is very important. So the higher in the code a condition is, the higher its priority is. So let's say this was not met, then the else if would be checked.
if the first one is met, then this else if is not checked. If the if is not met, the if condition, and the else if condition is not met, only then this else code block will be executed. And that is something that is very important. So if the if block is already met, then else if and else within the same if else block will be ignored. So you have seen greater, double equal sign, the double and sign, and also the double pipe for the or, but there are also other if statement operators, and here you can see a summary. So there is not only greater, but there is also something called greater or equals. So for example, if I want to check if a variable has the value of 13 or higher, then I could use greater or equals 13. And then you have smaller or equals. The double equal sign is for equals, so we actually compare something exactly to each other, so the values have to be the same. Or there's not equals, where it's just the opposite, so it just says, okay, those two values are not the same. And then and or is something that we have seen. All right, now let's go into practice. So I'm just gonna go back to my program, and in here I'm going to go to console app and not to our project. Okay, so here this is pretty much just my playground where I'm just going to play around with values. So here we're going to use a very basic if statement, and as you can see, if I press double tap, it will create this structure for me. So if true, then run some code. So in these brackets I can add my condition. Now instead of just true, which will always be executed, I can add my condition where I check, for example, is num1 equal 13? And if that's the case, then please write onto the console num1 condition is met. Now if we run that code again, we can see num1 condition is met. So this code is executed. Now if we wanted to check if num1 is 23 and we run the code again, you can see that this text is not written here. So this piece of code is skipped because this condition here is not true. Now what if we do the opposite? So we say, okay, I want to check if num1 is not 23. Now in any other case except for 23, this condition here will be true because num1 is not equal 23 in our case. We get this code, num1 condition is met. Okay, so you can not only write something like condition A and B and so forth, but you can write any type of code within your curly brackets, and that will be executed if a specific condition is met. Now let's have a little more challenging examples here where we say if num1 is smaller num2. So now I'm not comparing to a specific hard-coded value, but I'm comparing two variables to each other. I'm saying is num1 smaller than num2, and if it's the case, then execute num1 greater num2, and I'm going to use else if num1 greater num2 smaller num2. Now if I want to have another example where I just say, okay, is num1 greater num2, then I want to write num1 greater num2. Okay, nothing too fancy here, but there are these two different conditions. Now let's check it out. And we get num1 smaller num2. And that is because 13 is smaller than 25. All right, now if we want to get all of the other possible conditions, because we are not catching one of the conditions, and that's the one where num1 is equal num2. And that's something that we could either do with another else if, or we can just use else here where we just say, okay, in any other case, so if those are not met, then please execute else. Okay, so I could go ahead and say num1 is equal num2. Now let's make them equal. So num1 is going to be 13 and num2 is also going to be 13. Let me run that again. And you can see num1 is equal num2. All right. There's one thing that I really want to highlight though. Okay, so if we have something like num1 greater 10 and here num1 greater 3, then it doesn't make sense. Okay, I'm going to show you why. So I'm going to change the text here as well. Num1 greater 3 and num1 greater 10. And this one here, num1 lower or less than 3. Now the problem here is, let's execute it and you will see. It says num1 greater 3, but it's also greater 10 because it's 13. So why is this code not executed? And I said that in the theoretical part, but I also wanted to highlight it here. It's really important. This if statement has the highest priority. If that one is met, so if this condition is met, all of the other ones in the same structure are ignored. So this else if is ignored, this else is ignored because this one is true. The same goes for if this one is false and that one is true, then the else will be ignored. So else is really only going to be executed if none of the above are true. And that counts for a construct. What I mean with this is that if I have another if statement here at the bottom, so here I check num2, for example, is it greater than 3 and so forth. This one will not be influenced by this if statement. So it's a completely new if statement. Okay. But within the same if statement, this applies what I've just explained. So now you have seen how it works with numbers. Let's have a quick look at strings as well. So if, and we have this string called name. Name is equal to Dennis. Then it's going to say something like, hi Dennis, else if name is equal to Francis, then it's going to execute CW, hi Francis. And if the name is something else, so else, just say CW, hi stranger. Okay, so let's execute this code. And we see it says hi Francis. But now let's say we want not to check for Francis, but for Frank. Hi Frank should be written. And now if we run it again, it will say hi stranger. You can see hi stranger. Why is that? Well, if we look at it, what kind of value is stored, or what value is stored within name? Now let's go all the way up and you can see name, there is this value Francis stored in there. So it's not Dennis, it's not Frank, so it's the else block. So this code block will be executed and it will say hi stranger. Now let's combine everything that we have learned so far and go back to our project. All right, so I'm gonna switch my project. I'm gonna go to the toolkit app that we have used here. Now you know how to get the user input. You know how to store the user input within a variable. That's what we did here. So that's how we did it. You also know how to check if a variable has a specific value. And that's exactly what I want you to do here. So I want you to add the if statement, including the else ifs, where we check, has the user entered F, has the user entered G, or has the user entered Y? And depending on what he has entered, you just write user input was and then the name behind it. So if it was F, it should say Facebook. If it's G, it should say Google. If it's Y, it should say YouTube. So please go ahead and try to do that. Okay, I hope you tried it. I hope you paused the video real quick. So we check if user input is equal to F, then go ahead and write user input was, and actually we can hard code it Facebook. Now we check else if, and I'm gonna be lazy. I'm just going to copy the whole if statement and paste it in here. As you can see, now I have this else if, and instead of F, I'm just gonna say G, and it's going to be Google. And once again, I copy this whole else if statement, and instead of G, I'm gonna say Y, and this is going to be YouTube. And that's it. So there we are. We have already our if else if statement, which covers all the different versions. Now, what if the user entered none of the above? Then we can use the else block. And here we're just gonna say user input was, and then whatever the user input was. All right, so let's run it. Simply write the key and press enter. So I'm gonna enter F, and it says user input was Facebook. Now the problem is I can't go back. So I cannot go back and now enter G. I have to restart my application. And that's something that we will look at later on, but for now it's good. So if I enter G, it says was Google. Now let me enter some gibberish. And you can see user input was Asdolf, or Asdöffel actually. All right, so that's already a good point. We are getting there step by step. And now you have seen how to use if statements. So what you have learned so far is how to use the console, how to store values within a variable, how to use if statements in order to run code only if a specific condition is met or if some other conditions are met. Next up are arrays. And here's an official definition. An array is a data structure that contains a group of elements. Typically, these elements are all of the same data type, such as integer or string. Arrays are commonly used in computer programs to organize data so that a related set of values can be easily sorted or searched. All right, so that's the general definition, but what does that mean? Now let's have a look at an array. Here we see an example for an array in C#. So what you can see, there is an array called all scores, which is of type int. Now we use these square brackets here, which indicates that we are talking about an array. Now we have the name all scores, and then we use this new keyword. So we are creating a new integer array, which contains those 4 values. So we can define the values within the curly brackets that you can see here. And again, we end the whole statement with a semicolon. Now, in order to access elements from that array, we need to enter the name of the array, but also in square brackets, the index. Now, if we use 0, we get 97. Why is that? Because at index 0, so at the 0th position, there is this value 97 within this array. And that's generally how programming languages count. They start counting at 0. They don't start counting at 1 like us humans. They start at 0, then comes 1, 2, 3, and so forth. So the first entry within our array is 97, which means index 0 is 97. Index 2 is 81. So I just skipped 1 just for you to be a little confused. But yeah, you can see here, index 1 is 92, index 2 is 81, index 3 is 60. And now if we try to access index 4, we get an error. It's called index out of bounds exception that we get here. So we're trying to access an element within an array which does not exist. And that's something that we have to be very careful about. All right, so that's the basic structure of an array. And I'd say, let's go ahead and create some arrays. So let's go back to our project. And in this case, I mean the console app, because that's just our playground where we create stuff. So let's create an array in here. And here, I'm just gonna say array. So we create an array by doing so. We say of which type the array should be. So in this case, of type integer. Then we need to use the square brackets to indicate that this is going to be an array. And then we create a name, and I'm just gonna call these results. So we have results, and here I need to use the new int, square brackets, and then curly brackets. And within those curly brackets, I can define the values. So for example, I could go ahead and enter the value 1, 2, 3, and so forth. So I can just enter any value that I want in here. Now, in order to access a specific value within my array, I have to go ahead and say results at position, for example, 0. Now I can access it this way, but I can also overwrite it. So let's say I want to overwrite the position 0 or the index 0 value with 42. And now let's go ahead and write that onto the console. So results index 0 is, and then plus results at position 0. Now let me run that again. And we can see the result index 0 is 42. And that's because we have overwritten it. So here we declare and initialize the array. And here we overwrite the value. And then finally, here we access it. So accessing. All right, so now a little challenge for you. Please go ahead and create an array with all of your friends, or at least 5 of your best friends, let's say. So go ahead and create an array with text value entry. So we're not talking about integers this time, we're talking about a different data type. So please try to create an array with this other data type, which contains 5 values. All right, I hope you tried it. So we need to use a string, and I'm just gonna call this friends, and it will be a new string array. So I need the square brackets here as well, and then the curly brackets. Now in here, I can enter all of the values. And as it is with strings, we need to use quotation marks. So we need to use those quotation marks for every single entry. So let's say I have Mats here, I have Vlad, Thomas, Ilya, and Michael in here. So these are just some friend names that I have, and now I can go ahead and access those. So I can go ahead and let's say I want to access the friend at position 2. Guess which one it will be? It will be Thomas. So let's see if that's true. So CW friend at index 2 is plus friends index 2. Now let me run the app, and you can see friend at index 2 is Thomas. And why is that? Well, that's because Mats is at 0, Vlad is at 1, and Thomas is at 2. So we basically start with 0 once again, as we did here as well. So arrays start with 0 with index 0. Hey, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. Now, what if I want to greet every single friend that I have here? Then I could use something called a loop. So I want to greet every friend, but I don't want to write it out. So I don't want to write this code 5 times because I have 5 friends here. I just want to write one piece of code, which is going to greet every single one of them. So something like CW, hi, and then friends at 0. And then in this next line of code, I could write something like hi, friend at index 1, and so forth. But I don't want to do that manually. I want to write one code which greets every single friend. And I can do that in multiple ways. I can use a simple for loop, a while loop, a for each loop, but generally a loop. So now let's have a look at loops. So a for loop looks like this. For, and then in brackets, int I equals 0, I, for example, less than 5, I plus plus. So that's generally how a loop would look like. So for example, I can go ahead and say something like I plus times looped. So let's run it and you will see what happens. So you can see 0 times looped, then 1 time looped, 2-time loop, 3-time loop, and 4-time loop. So the grammar is not perfect, but it simply runs this code multiple times. And how many times does it run it? It runs it depending on what we have here. So we say our starting value is going to be I with the value of 0. So this is my counter variable called I. As you can see, it's an integer, so it's a whole number. And here I have a comparison. So I am checking, similar to an if statement, I'm checking, is I smaller than 5? As long as that is the case, please execute this code. And once you're done executing, do this here, I++. What does I++ mean? It just means increment I by 1, which means increase I by 1. So in the first loop through, it was 0. In the second loop through, it will be 1. Then it will be 2, 3, 4, and then it will be 5. And once it's 5, it will be checking once again. So it will be checking every single time, right? Single loop through. So the first loop through, I0, is 0 less than 5. Yes, that's the case. So please execute this code and then increase by 1. Now I is 1. 1 less than 5. Yes, it's true. All right, so please execute this code. Next loop through, I is 2, then it's 3, then it's 4, and then it's 5. So it has checked every single time, but with 5 there is something specific happening here, because now 5 less than 5. No, it's not true. All right, so please go ahead, and the code is finished for this for loop. The loop through is done. Go to the next line of code. So it would just jump here, and the for loop will not run any further. So that's basically what's happening here. So we have this very basic for loop which just runs multiple times, and it runs as long as a specific condition is met. If I wanted to run this 15 times, then I would just say, okay, start with 0 and go up to 15. Let's run it again. And you can see 0 time, 1 time, 2 time, and so forth, up to 14. So in total, 15 times. Of course, I could also start at 1 and not at 0. So then it will say 1 time, 2 time, and then we could, of course, change the grammar here, add an S here in brackets, so it looks a little better. 1 times looped, 2 times looped, and so forth. All right. So that's a very basic for loop. Now the cool thing is I can go ahead and loop through my string array of friends. So I can say something like hi plus friends at index I. And here I need to add a plus, of course. Now, if I do that, I will run into a little error. So by the way, I'm changing this to 0 here because I start at index 0. But the problem is this here. I go up to 15. So if I run this code, it will run it. Here you can see hi Mats, hi Vlad, and so forth. And the first Mats is the one that I hard coded before, so that one here. But the one in the for loop is also run, and then my code crashes. You can see I get this index out of range exception. And this pretty much means we're trying to access an index in my array that is not existing. And there are two ways to solve this. One, we are using a for each loop. The other one, we are checking for the length of friends. So of the friends array. Now there is something that I'm not gonna go into too much in here, but what I can do is I can just say friends, this array here, dot length. And this will give me the amount of entries within my array. So if I have 5 entries in here, then this value here will equal 5. And if I run this code once again, then I will not get this error. So it will only run as often as we have entries within my array. And that's what we did with this dot length. What's happening here is that we are accessing a property of our friends array, but that would go a little too far in this video. I'm of course covering this concept in my entire course. If you want to check it out, check the link in the description. So there I of course go a lot more into depth about for loops and loops in general. There are other types of loops, not just the for loop, of course, also the while loop, the do while loop, and so forth. All right, so that's the for loop. Now, as I told you, there is another solution to this, and it's the for each loop. And the for each loop is actually the preferred loop in order to loop through an array. And looping through an array is what I want to do in this video. So let's go ahead and check out for each loops. All right, so now you have seen how to create arrays and how to use for loops in order to loop through those arrays. But there is an even nicer way to do that, and that's the for each loop. The for each loop allows us to pretty much just run through arrays. That's exactly what the for each loop is for, to loop through an array. And here you can see an example for such a for each loop. It's just the keyword for each, then you have the data type of the array. So you can see here we're using int, and the data type of the array is also int. So we say int score in all scores. So we just say, okay, this score integer should be that particular value that we're currently looking at within the all scores array. So in this example, what we have in the first loop through, score, so this int score variable will be the first entry within all scores. So this 97. In the second loop through, it will be the 92, then the 81, and so forth. So it will simply write onto the console the particular score each time that it's looping through our array. And that's it. That's pretty much it. So the only real difference is that this line here where it says for each in score in all scores is different to the one in for loops. So let's go back to our program and check out how this looks in real life. So let's go back to our console app. So here we had this for loop which said hi to every single friend. Now please go ahead and try to rebuild this with a for each loop where you also say hi to every single friend. And I'm also going to get rid of this line that I had here which said hi to my friend Mats multiple times. Okay, I hope you tried it. So we are using the for each keyword. And now the cool thing is you don't have to type everything manually. You just double tap and there we are. Bam, var item in collection. Because that's exactly what it is. You have a variable data type of a specific item within your collection for each single loop through. So instead of var, I'm going to now say string because we're looking through strings. Then it's not well, we could call it item, but I'm just going to call it friend in friends because friends is the collection. So an array is a collection. There are other collection types in C#, but in this video we are only going to cover the arrays. Of course, you can check out my whole course there. You will find other collection types as well. All right, so now each time that we loop through the friends, I want to write it onto the console. Now I'm going to just say hi there and then plus friend. So here I don't need to say friends I as I did here. I just say friend because friend, this variable here, is actually the particular friend within the array that we're currently looking at. So now let me run that so you can see how this actually results in. So here you see hi there Mats, hi there Vlad, hi there Thomas, hi there Ilya, and hi there Michael. So it's pretty much the same thing as before, only that here I needed to say, okay, give me the index so-and-so. And here in the for each loop, I know that it's going to loop through the whole array. And I'm just going to say, okay, give me that particular item that you're currently looking at in the collection. All right. So I hope you managed to create this for each loop. Now you have seen two different types of loops. As I said, there are two more loop types, the do while and the while loop, and those will be covered in my complete course, of course, as well. All right, next, I would like to show you something called a method. And in order to create a method, I need to get out of my main method. So I cannot create a method within a method. Now it's a little difficult to see, but here you can see this is where my main method started. And actually, let me do it like this. Okay, so I just slammed it all together. So if I press this plus key here, I can see the whole content of the main method. And if I press the minus, I just bring it all together. So you can see this is the content of the main method. If you hover over it, you can see the content of it. But I want to create a new method. I'm going to call this one do something. So it's going to be a very generic method. And this is really just to show you the basic concepts of methods. So in here, I'm just going to say something like CW do something was executed / called. Okay. Now this do something method is now created. And if I want to call it, I need to call it from the main method or from something that is actually being executed. And in our case, it's only the main method that is executed. So I'm just going to call it straight at the start. So here at the very top, I'm just going to call it do something method. And in order to call a method, so in order to execute a method, you just enter the name of the method and then you use the brackets and a semicolon. So now let me run this and you will see that it's actually being called. So it says do something was called or it was executed. But what the heck happened there? You might wonder what is going on here. Why do we use static? What is this void? Why do I have these curly brackets? Well, the general structure of a method is the following. So here, access modifier, then the keyword static, the return type, and the name. And then within the curly brackets, the code that should be executed once the method is called. So in our case, we have no access modifier. Having no access modifier makes this do something not accessible from outside of my class program. If I wanted to access this method from somewhere else, I would have to make it public. And access modifiers is something that I'm going to cover in my whole course, but this video would go too far to actually explain this concept of access modifiers. But generally, what they are used for is to make your program more stable and less prone to errors, pretty much. All right, so we have this keyword static, and it's in brackets here because it's not required if you want to call a method from another method that is not static. Okay, but as our main method is static, we need to also use this keyword static. So this is the general structure of a method. We have the access modifier, or we can not have an access modifier. In this case, we don't have an access modifier, and all the access modifiers are public, protected, internal, and private. I'm not going to go too much into those access modifiers. I will cover them a little bit with fields later on, but I'm not going to go into them regarding methods, okay? But pretty much what they just do is they can make it possible to access this method from outside of this class program or only within that class program. Depending on which of those four you use, you would receive different behaviors. Then you have this keyword static, and the static keyword is only required here because I want to call this method within my main method. And because the main method is static, the do something method has also to be static. I cannot call a method from the same class within the main method if it's not static. That's generally how it is. So that's something that you have to deal with. If you want to know more about this static keyword, you can see use the static modifier to declare a static member which belongs to the type itself rather than to a specific object. And just at the point where we're talking about objects and types and those kind of things, it already goes a little too far for this video, because then we would have to go into object-oriented programming on a very deep level. Okay, but if you want to know more about this keyword static and about access modifiers, you can of course check out the documentation, or you can of course check out my course where I will show you multiple different examples for this topic, and you will understand in depth what's going on there. But what we really need to have here is a return type, which is this void, and void means empty, so it will return nothing. The only thing that this method does is it will run some code. Then you have the name, and this is the name of the method. It's called do something, and here the naming convention is to use a capital letter at the start of the name of this method, and then use, of course, a describing name. Then we have the brackets, as you can see here, and the curly brackets. And everything that is within the curly brackets will be executed once our do something method is called. So once this code here is executed, so in line 9, even before we create a variable name, and even before we have this if else and so forth, our do something method will be called. And that's exactly why we get this at the very top where it says do something was executed. So if I move this call, or actually let me leave it here. Okay, so we have it here at the very bottom, and let me add it somewhere in between as well. So I'm just gonna call do something here as well. Again, I'm using the brackets and a semicolon in order to finish the statement. And now if I run it again, you will see that do something was called here, then hi stranger was executed or typed or written onto the console, and then we have do something was executed again. Okay, so we can call this method multiple times, and that's already the advantage of methods, because you can create a big chunk of code and you can execute that big chunk of code with just one line of code. So just with this line of code, with this call, this method call, I can execute everything that is within those curly brackets. And I only have to define it once. I don't have to define it 10 times or so. I can really just define it once, and I can reuse it all the time. So you can say it's something like a recycling tool. And not just that, it also helps you to keep things clean and tidy. Okay, so this is a very basic example of a method. Let's have a look at another one where we actually return something. So I'm gonna say static int calculate. So what this method should do is it should calculate something. Now, as you can see, I'm receiving a little error here which says not called paths return a value, or not all code paths. And that has to do with this int, because before in this void method, if I get rid of this code, the do something is not complaining, it's all fine. That has to do with this void because it's not expecting any return. So it doesn't expect anything to be returned. Now here it needs something. So I can just return 0 here, for example. Okay, now the error disappears. But now calculate, usually you would say, okay, it should calculate something, right? So let's say when this method is called, I want to multiply two values. So int num1 and int num2 should be multiplied, and I want to return the result. So I'm just going to return num1 multiplied with num2. Okay, so what's going on in here is we have this method called calculate, which returns of a type integer value. And as you can see, this return num1 multiplied with num2 actually returns an integer, because an integer multiplied with an integer will be an integer. So we are returning an integer. So this whole method is going to work. Now, what is going on here? What is this stuff? That is called a parameter. So this is a parameter, and this one is another parameter. So we have two parameters here. And parameters are types of variables which can be set once this method is called. So let's say I want to call this method in my main method, okay? I'm gonna do that just right here after the f result. So it's at the very end of our main method, except for our read key. This one should still be in there. Okay, so I'm gonna call this calculate method. As you can see, I can call this method, and now it expects an integer num1 and an integer num2 separated by a comma. So I can say something like 25 and 25. So I can, for example, multiply 25 with 25, or let's say 35. So I'm gonna calculate, and it will give me a result. Now, what's going to happen with the result? Let's have a look. We calculate it and nothing. What's going on? Why is there no result? Well, That's because we never print the result. So we are returning it, but we're never printing it out. So what we do here is we pretty much get a value of type int. So we could actually store it in another variable. So we could go ahead and say new result is going to be whatever we calculated. And now we can actually go ahead and print it out. So we can say new result from method is, and then we use the new result. So now let's run it again. And what we will see is the method result is 875. Holy guacamole, what just happened? So much at the same time. So many concepts combined into one minute. So let's have a look at this in more depth because I ran through it very quickly. But generally what we have here is a method. And we have seen that you can create methods like this one, do something, which return void, which pretty much means they just execute some code. They don't return anything. They run some code and that's it. But then you can also create methods which actually return something. And in this case, I'm returning an integer. So I'm using this calculate method, which returns an integer. Now, this method, it has two parameters here. These are two parameters, and we can define those in here so that whenever somebody tries to call this calculate method, so whenever the method is called in our code as it is here, we need two values. We need two values of type integer. One that we've given here and another one here. And whatever those two values are is going to be relevant in here because we multiply those two and we return them. And it has to be the same data type as here because we are returning an integer. That's what we said here. So we actually need to return an integer. We could not return something like hello here. That wouldn't work because it's a string. Hello is a string and we expected an integer here. Okay, so that's what we pretty much did here. We just called this method. Then we stored whatever was returned in our new result integer variable that we have here. And then we used it in a console write line simply to be printed out. So that's what we did. All right, so that's generally how you can use methods. And this is just an example with integers. We could have done the same thing with strings where we just say, give me a first name and the last name, and then return the full name or things like that. You can do those kind of things, and you can do even more complex things with methods. And methods are a very core component of any programming language that is an object-oriented programming language. All right, so that's the concept of methods. And I think because it was a little fast and it's a big and important aspect of any programming language, I would like you to go ahead and do a little challenge. So write some code yourself and actually try to build this example that I've just explained to you, where somebody has to enter two strings and the method should return a string. So the two strings should be first name and last name. And a result, so pretty much the return statement, should return the full name. So first name, empty space, last name should be returned as one string by this method. And if somebody calls it, the person should also be greeted. Okay, so you can not only return something in here, you could also do something like console.writeLine, and in here we could say result is plus num1 multiplied with num2. So we can do this console write line statement in here as well. So we wouldn't need all of this stuff around, right? So we could just say, okay, let me get rid of this stuff here and let's run it as well. And as you can see, we still get the result is 875. Okay, I just wanted to show you that you actually can store the result within another variable. Okay, but now the challenge is create this method that combines first name and last name and just greets the person with their full name. All right, I hope you paused the video and you tried it. So first we need static. We return a string and say greet greet full name, and it will be string first name and string last name. And then we return first name plus last name. And here, actually, I don't need those ones here.
Hey, don't forget to subscribe and like the video.
First name plus last name. And if I want to have the empty space in between, I of course need to add that empty space in between there. And of course, we need to finish it with a semicolon. So now what we do here is whenever somebody calls greet full name, we ask them for two values, first the first name, then the last name, and we simply return first name plus last name as the full name. Now let's call this method just below the calculate method. So in here, I'm just gonna say greet full name. And here it's going to be Dennis Panyuta. Now, this is not actually greeting. So if we wanted to greet, we of course would need to go ahead and use a console write line statement in here to greet someone. Okay, so let's do that. And I'm just gonna copy this. I'm gonna say hi plus first name plus empty space plus last name. Now this return statement is something that is going to return this full name. So we could store it somewhere if we call it, but what I wanted to show you are both options. Okay, so let's run this. And there we are. Hi, Dennis Panyuta. Now, it's returning a string, as I said, right? So we can store it in a string variable that will be full name is equal to greet full name. Okay, so if we run it again, we're still being greeted, but at the same time, the full name is stored in a variable, and we could go ahead and use that for a full name later on in our program. Okay, but what if we don't want to return anything? What if you only want to say hello to the full name? Now we could get rid of this whole return statement, but if we do so, then our method here should have a void as return type. And then of course we cannot do this anymore here. Then we can only call this greet full name without this void. And now you can see the difference already. So if you have a return type here, then you need to return. If you have void, you don't need to return. If you return something, then you can store it within a variable. If you don't return anything and use void, you cannot store it in a variable. So this is just going to execute whatever code is within those curly brackets. Now, if I run this again, you can see it still says, hi, Dennis Panyuta. And now we saw the two different versions. So one is with string and the other one is with void. All right, so I hope you managed to create this little method. Whether you choose void as a return type or string as a return type, I hope you managed to do that. If not, now you know how it's done. All right, so now let's go over to the last bigger concept, and that is creating a class and creating objects from that class. So far, we have only worked in one class, and that was our first main class with a main method, and we didn't do any real object-oriented programming in that sense. And in this video, I'm going to show you a little glimpse of what's going to happen in the next chapter. So let's go ahead and have a look at what a class is in general. A class is a blueprint of an object, and that's where this object-oriented programming comes from. So pretty much you can create multiple objects of a specific class that you can create yourself. And we even have used classes already, as you know. For example, the console class or the string class and so forth. Then a class has actions, abilities, which are so-called member functions or methods. So we have used methods already from even those classes that we have seen. So console, for example, there were methods that we have used as read or read line, write line, those kind of things. So these were methods or so-called member functions of that class. Then it has properties, so-called member variables, such as length. We have seen the length property of one class, and that was our string class, where we checked how long is the string, and that was a property of that class. So you can create multiple different properties and you can call them later on. Then inheritance is possible with classes, and we'll have a look at inheritance in a additional chapter where we'll look into inheritance in more detail. But now, just for you to know, it's possible to inherit classes. And they can be used like a data type. For example, a string is a class, and we have used strings as data types. All right, so next one is an object. What is an object? Well, you can create objects out of a class. So as I said, it's a blueprint for an object, a class. Now we see an object here, which is a car, and it's an Audi. And the properties of that car could be the horsepower, the amount of wheels, the lumen of the front light, then the doors, and many more properties. Then the abilities would be to drive, to brake, to open a window, make light, and so forth. Plenty of abilities. And then finally inheritance would work like that. You have a car which inherits to Audi. So an Audi is a car but has specifics. Then an A5 is an Audi but has its own specifics, and so forth. So this is just a very brief introduction into object-oriented programming and into classes, and we're gonna go into the demo where you'll see all those things in action and get a better understanding for what they do and what the purpose is and how we can use them. Okay, so for the next part, we are going to need a different project because this is a little loaded already, and you can of course use the same project, but I'm just gonna create a new project for this. And I'm going to call this one classes minus basics. And in here, I'm going to get rid of console write line. We are going to create our own class, which is a blueprint of a data type. So we can create our own data types by creating a class, and that class can have properties, that class can have methods, and so forth. So let's go ahead and create a new class. So I'm going to right click onto my C# level, and I'm going to create a new class here, and I'm going to call that one human.cs. So now let's go ahead. In my human class, I want to create members, and members are, for example, variables. Members can be methods and so forth, and they are called members because they are part of that specific class. So let's say I have a member variable, and for a human, that would be, for example, a string called first name. That would be a great member variable. And so this human is our data type, so I can create an object off of that. So I'm just going to create a human now. I'm going to call the human Dennis is a new human. And that's how I do it. So this is how I create an object of my class, or also called an instance of human. So this instance is called Dennis, and now this Dennis has a first name. So if I would like to change the first name, there are multiple ways to implement that. You could do that with a constructor and so forth. And we're going to do that. No worries. We're going to do all of that. But I'm going to keep it simple in this video. So you first of all understand that this is actually a blueprint. So class human is a blueprint now. And let's say I want to introduce myself. So this human class has multiple capabilities or skills. So for example, you can drink. All right, how much can you drink, or how much do you drink? So each time you drink, you could have a parameter, how much did you drink? So in order to see how hydrated you are. So let's say there is a hydration level from 0 to 100. How hydrated are you? And each time you drink, let's say half a liter, then it increases your hydration level by 30% or by 40%. So that's how you could, for example, design a human in programming purposes. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a method which will introduce me, and this is going to be a member method because it's part of my human class, which is a blueprint. So this class is a blueprint for a data type, and this method is going to be a void, public void introduce myself. And what it will do is it will simply write something onto the console. It's going to write something like hi, and then it's going to write the first name. All right. So now, as you can see, first name doesn't have a value. And if I try to store something into Dennis, so if I try to change the first name, I can't do that. That's because it's protected. And it's protected because there is no public before that. So if you don't add a public, this variable is going to be protected and not accessible from outside. So from outside this class. I can still use it within this class, as you could see, because I have used it here and it was no problem. But if I make it public, I can now also use it from my program CS. So I can simply say Dennis first name, and I'm going to set that. So I'm going to set that to Dennis. Now I'm going to introduce Dennis. So Dennis is going to introduce himself just like that. So you see, this is how I can access private, or actually this is public variable from outside, and even change it. And this is how I can call methods of the class, or in this case of the object Dennis. So Dennis is of type human, which means it's of this class's type. So this is the blueprint, and it has a method called introduce myself, and this is the method that I'm going to call here. So if I run the code, and in order to see something on the console, I also want to read the key so my console doesn't shut down straight away. And there we are. So hi, I'm Dennis is written onto the console. So let's say I create a new object, which I'm gonna call human Michael. There's a new human. And now if I introduce Michael, so introduce myself, if I just run the code like that, you will see that it just says, hi, I'm empty space. And that's because we didn't set the name of Michael. So let's say we want to save the name or change the name straight away in here. So I'm just gonna say Michael here. Let's test that. Let's run the code.
Hey, don't forget to subscribe and like the video.
And in this case, it's actually gonna work. So it's gonna say, hi, I'm Dennis, and hi, I'm Michael. So what we do here is we say every single human is gonna be called Michael as long as you don't change it. So Dennis has actually changed it, but Michael has never changed the name. So Michael is still gonna be Michael. But if we, let's say, change the name Michael to Mikael or something like that. So let's say he wants to introduce himself in a different language, and there he's gonna be called Mikkel, or yeah, for example, Mikkel would be an option. Then it would be overridden and we see, hi, I'm Dennis, and hi, I'm Mikkel. All right. So this is how you can actually make sure that this is always the same. So this variable is gonna be always the same, first name, except you change it. So now if I make it private, so let me stop that. I'm gonna make it private string Michael. Now I'm gonna receive an error here because I cannot change the first name because it's private now. So neither Dennis nor Mikkel or Michael can now change their name. So those two objects are gonna be the same. So it's gonna be, hi, I'm Michael, hi, I'm Michael. So they don't differ in any way. So now you see why it makes sense to make this method here public, and it's actually a public method. And it really doesn't seem to make sense to make this private because now I cannot change it. Well, actually there are, as I said, multiple ways to change it. One of them is creating a property. The other one is to create constructors. And we're gonna do both of that. So I'm gonna start off with constructors in the next video where you will see how to go ahead with that. So now, first of all, a little challenge for you. So create a public variable last name of type string, change the introduce myself method so it tells the whole name. So it doesn't just say the first name, but also the last name. Then create two objects with full information about themselves in our program CS, so in the main method. All right, I hope you paused the video and tried to do that. So let's go ahead, and I'm gonna make it public string last name, which is going to be empty for now. The same here. I'm gonna change that first name to not being Michael anymore because not everyone is called Michael. Then I'm changing introduce myself to also tell the last name. So I'm gonna need that here, last name. And now let's create two objects with full information about themselves. So I'm gonna get rid of, so actually let me just clean up everything here. So first of all, human, and I'm gonna call her Sissy, is a new human. And now Sissy has a first name. So first name is going to be Sissy. And her last name, well, actually I don't know what Sissy's last name is. I'm gonna call her Wagner. And then we have Sissy, who introduces herself. Introduce myself. And now we have a different person, human, Franzel, new human. And that Franzel is going to be called, actually Franzel. It's a very uncommon name, but it's a very old funny name in Austrian. And that Franzel's last name is going to be Müller. You can actually write it with U as well. You don't need to use this Ü, this special sign here. Okay, and that person should introduce himself as well. So introduce myself is what he's gonna say. So let's run the code, and we see, hi, I'm Sissy Wagner. Hi, I'm Franzel Müller. So there we are. You see how to use human, or how to use your own data type. So we're gonna look into that a bit more, because for now, as I said, this is just a member, just a variable. And I talked about properties earlier on. So for example, length was a property, but properties are written with a capital letter at the start. And we're gonna look into properties. And of course, we're also gonna look into constructors, because why would I have to do it this way if I can simply do the whole thing in one line? So let's say I could enter something like Sissy and Wagner right here, and that human would already be created. Then I wouldn't have to do all of these additional lines. So I could simply do that in the same line. And that's exactly what you can achieve by using constructors. And that's what we're gonna do in the next video. So I hope you could manage to do the little challenge that you have here. We're gonna have a look at constructors. As I told you earlier, that they can really improve the amount of code that you need. So you don't need that much code. For example, what we have written here is something that we can decrease by a lot. So we can decrease those, or we can even get rid of those 2 lines for each object. So we could put them into the human when we initialize it. So let's just do that. Let's create a new method here, which is called a constructor. It's very close to a method. It's not really a method. It's a constructor, which is also a member, right? So let's create a constructor, and it's public, and it has the same name as the class itself. But as you can see here, there's no void, there's no string, there's no return value. It doesn't need it. It just needs the access modifier, and in this case, it's the public, and then you need human. So you should use public, because otherwise you cannot use this constructor. So it's really important to use public here. Then in here you can add the parameters that you want to have each time that you create an object of this class. So let's say I want to have a string first name and a string last name. So each time somebody creates a human, he needs to give me this information. So let's have a look here. As we can see in a second, as soon as it understands that there is a constructor, it's complaining because it says that there are arguments missing. So there's no argument given that corresponds to the required formal parameter first name of human. So it needs 2 strings here. And the first one will be the name, the first name, and the second one will be the last name. But that alone will not be enough. So let's also fix that, because as we know, this human has member variables, which are, for example, first name and last name. And we want to change those each time that we create an object. And we do that by saying first name is equal to first name. And that might sound a little confusing, and it actually doesn't work, because it says here, oh no,
I don't understand what you want. You can assign the same thing. You can't assign the same thing to the same thing. So the same variable to the same variable. So what you can do here, and there are two different approaches. So either you change this variable name to, let's say, my first name, and then you simply say that the global first name is going to be my first name. That's one way. All right, so now it works. Or you can use the this keyword. So this dot last name is equal to last name. And now it suddenly works. Why does it? Well, it's because this last name means that I want to have the last name of this object, and it's going to be this last name. So the member variable and not the local one. So this string my first name and string last name are local variables pretty much. So they are parameters, yes, but they are, well, used as if they were local variables. So outside of this method or of this constructor, nobody will know this my first name variable, for example. It's only known in here. So now what I do is I just say, okay, this last name, so the one from the object, should be the value that is given to me whenever a human is created. So whenever this constructor is called. So a constructor is pretty much like a method that is called whenever an object is created. So in this case, whenever this human class is used as a data type, it's going to use the constructor and it's going to call the constructor. So as you can see, these are the two different ways that you can do that. So now let's go ahead and go back to the program. And as you can see, I can simply add the values in here. So Sissy and let's say Wagner. And I'm going to get rid of all the other things that we have here. So we only have Sissy now, and Sissy's going to introduce herself. So now you see we have limited the whole code, or reduced the whole code to just one line. We had 4 lines before, or 3, and now we just have this one line. So we say the same thing. So hi, I'm Sissy Wagner. So it just hands over the first name and hands over the last name. So if you hover over human, you can see what it needs. It needs string my first name and string last name. And if we look at our human class, that's exactly what we have here. So now you see how you can use a constructor. And I'm gonna actually change that to first name, and I'm gonna also use this. And here it should be also first name. Because I like to use this, so I always know, okay, I'm using the field, or I'm using the member variable, which is the global variable, right? By the way, now we don't need to use public anymore. So we can make it private. We can make both variables private now. Just so you see that it's still working. Let's run the code again. And you see, hi, I'm Sissy Wagner. So now I don't actually access those variables from here anymore. I simply create a constructor, or I create a human object, and I deliver the constructor, or I call the constructor by handing over this information. And I need to, because otherwise the whole object won't be created. It's going to result in an error, as you could see. So here now it doesn't like the code. It says, oh, there is something missing. There is a constructor information missing. So this is no argument, or there is no argument given that corresponds to the required formal parameter last name. All right, so I'm just gonna give it the last name again. And what was Sissy? Her name was, I'm just gonna call her Wagner. So now she married the other guy. And now, actually she was Wagner, right? Okay, so coming back to our constructor and our variables here, a little challenge for you. So here's the challenge. Add 2 more member variables to human. One is called iColor, the other one age. You should use the correct data types here. Then adjust the constructor so it requires all the 4 values to be used when creating an object of human. So it should use first name, last name, iColor, and age. And then create 2 objects of type human. And of course you need to create them within our program class. All right, so go ahead and pause the video and try to do that. All right, I hope you try to do that. So let's go ahead and first of all, create a public string I, or actually private string iColor,
and then private age, which is of type int. And now let's adjust the constructor. So I'm gonna add a string I color, and I'm gonna add an int age. And now I'm just gonna adjust the content of the constructor as well. So I color is going to be I color, and this dot age is going to be age. So now let's go back here and let's create an object, or actually two objects. So human, in my case it's going to be Dennis, is a new human, and I'm going to enter the first name, last name, and as you can see here, IntelliJ tells us what we need to enter. So first name, last name, I color, age. All right, so let's do that. I color is green, and age is an integer, so we just enter 29 in my case. And now I want Dennis to introduce himself. And the thing is, introduce myself has not been adjusted yet. So if I run that, it's not gonna add the great information about eye color and age yet. So let's go back to introduce myself and add that. I'm so-and-so and so-and-so old, so years old, and that will be our 2. My eye color is, and this is going to be our 3, which is the 4th value. So eye color and age. So I'm gonna add it in the order that I have used here in my text, not in the order that I've created the variables here. So now if we run the code again, we will see, hi, I'm Dennis Panuta and 29 years old. My eye color is green. Very useful information. Thank you very much. So now let's create the second one, human, and I'm gonna call it Amalia, which is my daughter. She's a new human and she's pretty new. Amalia Panuta. Her eye color is still blue. Babies tend to have blue eyes if their parents don't have brown. And now, how old is she? She's 1 year old. And now, Amalia, come on, introduce yourself, please. Unfortunately, she's not communicative enough, or she doesn't know how to speak yet, at least not these kind of information. So there we are. Hi, I'm Amalia Panuta and 1 year old. So that's something that you could even adjust. So you could create an if statement in the introduce yourself. So if somebody is below so-and-so, so below 2 years, so actually 1 and 0 years, or I'm not sure whether with 0 it works, but for 1 year you could say, okay, it's not years, but it's going to be year. You know what? I actually tried to do that. All right, I hope you tried it. So I'm just going to use a little if statement here. So if age is equal to 1, then do something else, and otherwise do that. So if age is, or year, actually 1 year old, and else do this. All right, and now it should be fine. So there we are. Hi, I'm Amalia and 1 year old. My eye color is blue. Great. So I hope you managed to do that, and now you see how to use constructors. Okay, now we can go back to our toolkit app and actually create a class. And in order to keep it simple, I'm going to create the class in the same file. Of course, I could go ahead and create another file for this, but I really want to keep it simple. And by the way, this is not best practice, so don't do that. I'm just going to do that because it's easier for you to see the different interactions between the two classes. It's a lot easier for you as a viewer, but when you write code, always go ahead and create a new file when creating a new class. Okay, so you would go ahead and create a new class here, add new class. Okay, but I'm not going to do that in here. I'm just going to write it like this. So class entry, because I want to have a class of entry. So I want to later create those 3 entries that we had, Facebook, Google, and YouTube. and therefore I need to create a blueprint of an object, and that will be this class here. So in here I will create 3 fields. So I'm gonna say public string URL, public string name, and public string key. And those 3 things are the URL to the website, the name of the website, for example, Facebook, and the key, which is, for example, this F. Okay. And in order to go ahead, I of course need to have a constructor. This constructor will be called once we create an object of our entry. So I'm just gonna say I need a new URL, I need a new name, and I also need a new key. So whenever we now create an entry, this constructor here will be called. And then here I'm just gonna say URL is going to be new URL, then new or name is going to be new name, and key is going to be new key. So the only thing that I'm really doing here is I'm saying when somebody creates an object of entry, whatever they enter as new URL should be the URL of that particular entry. Whatever they enter as the name should be the name of that entry, and whatever they enter as a key should be the key of that entry. So what does that even mean? Now let's have a look. Let's create an entry. First of all, we create a very basic entry here. I'm going to do that in the main method straight at the start. So I'm going to say entry, and I'm going to call this entry1. It's going to be a new entry. And in here, I need to enter the URL. So for example, www.facebook.com. Then I need the name, and that will be Facebook. And then I need the key, and that should be F. Okay, so that's my first entry. So now I could go ahead and access this entry. So I can just, for now, very basically, just write something like entry name is entry.name. And in this case, it's entry1.name. So now I'm accessing the name of the entry1. And in here, I need a plus for the error to disappear. Now let's run this just to see whether things are working. And we can see entry name is Facebook. Now let me get the entry URL. Entry URL. So I'm going to access this URL here. Let me run it again. And as you see, entry URL is www.facebook.com. Okay, so that seems to work. And I made those public, those fields here, those strings, URL, name, and key, I made them public so that I can access them from here. That is something that I do for simplicity. If I would make a real world application, I'd go ahead and create properties. But that would go a little too far for this video. So if you want to learn more about properties, check out my course. A link is in the description. All right, so we have this entry URL is entry.url, and we could do the same thing with the name and the key. And then we could go ahead and instead of using this approach here where we typed it in manually, we could access the actual entries and check those out. But in order to create multiple entries, I don't want to go ahead and do it manually for every single one like I did here with entry is equal entry1, new entry, and so forth. I want to store them within an array. So I want to have all the entries at one place. And with one place, I mean within this one variable. So as you know, an array is pretty much a variable which contains multiple entries. So let's go ahead and do that by using square brackets here. As you know, an array can contain multiple values. Now the cool thing is it can not only contain multiple values, but it can also contain multiple objects. So this entry1 here is an object, but I could create an entry array which contains all the different objects. And in this case, I could create one with Facebook, Google, and YouTube, and then I can easily extend it later on. So you can say entry, square brackets, entries, because we want to have multiple ones. It's going to be a new entry array. So in here, I need to enter all of the entries, and I'm gonna end the statement with a semicolon here. And of course, here I need to use the square brackets as well, because we're talking about an array here. So we're creating a new entry array, which contains the following entries. Now let's create the entries. New entry is www.facebook.com. Then the name is Facebook. Then our key is F. And I create the next entry. New entry is www.google.com. Google, and the character is G. And finally, another entry, www.youtube.com. The name is YouTube, and the character or the key is a Y. All right, so now I have created 3 objects of type entry, and I can access them. I can, for example, do what I did here with a for loop. Now with those 3 lines, it really doesn't make that much sense, right? You would usually just write those 3 lines. But if you want to create a program which is extendable, then you would use a for loop here. So let's go ahead and use this for loop, and because I'm running through an array, I'm actually going to use a for each loop. So I'm just gonna say go through every single entry. So go through this entries array that we have created here, this one. So we're going through this with a for each loop through every single one of them. So the first entry will be facebook.com. The second entry will be google.com. The third entry will be youtube.com. So I can simply do this console write line code that I had before with a \t in here. So \t plus entry.key plus a minus plus entry.name. Okay, so let's run that just to see what's happening. And as you can see, that's what we get. So we have the same result that we had before, but now we're using a for loop, or a for each loop to be precise. Now, as I said, this is extendable. So in this case, if we add a new entry, we don't have to enter this whole thing, console.writeLine \t entry name, so something like manually entered something. The only thing that we need to do is we need to create a new entry, and this code here will be flexible. Okay, that's the idea behind programming. Develop something that's flexible and that's going to be extendable later on. Now, the next thing we need to do is we need to write onto the console something like new option. And I want to do that in a new line. So I'm going to say \n your option. Now let's run this and see what's going to happen. As you can see, this is what we get. So this \n just creates a line break here, and that's why your option is in a new line. Okay, so we're getting the user input, and we check what the entry of the user is, but we did that in a manual way, which is not very flexible. So we are really hard coding it with the F, with the G, with the Y, and so forth. But what we really want to have is every single entry that we have in here should be checked. And whatever the user has entered, if there is an entry for the character that the user has entered, then please open the website. The approach that we have here is limited to only F, G, and Y. So if for whatever reason somebody enters a new entry in here, which could be tutorials.eu, then the user could not select tutorials.eu because it would just be ignored, because we have hard coded this in here and it's just not there. So what we need to do is we need to replace this whole code with something more flexible. So we use another for each loop here. where we go through the entries once again, as we did before. So we can copy this here. We go through the entries. And this time we don't want to write them, but we want to check them. So we want to see if the input that the user has entered, so the user input, is equal to the entry.key. So to this entry, to the key of the entry that we're currently looking at, which is within our entries array. Okay. And alternatively, the name. So maybe the user didn't enter the key, but he entered the name instead. So what we can say is here, user input is equal entry.name. Maybe he just didn't understand our program where we said simply write the key and press enter. Maybe he entered Facebook or something like that. All right, so in here is the actual important part. So this is where we start our Internet Explorer or our software. So in order to start any exe file, you can use the following code. You can use system.diagnostics.process. So there's a class called process, which contains a method called start. And this starts an exe file. So in here, you can either use entry.url, and that might work for you. In my case, it doesn't work with this particular program, but if you want to start a particular program, you can use @ and then in quotation the URL or the link to your file. So for example, you can add the whole link to your Internet Explorer like such. So let me just do that real quick. And I can open it up. And as you can see, now msn.com has been opened and my file Internet Explorer has opened. But it didn't use Facebook yet. So it didn't use my URL that I have given to it. It has just opened up Internet Explorer. Now, if you want to actually have the entry URL, you just have to say, okay, use this additional variable here, entry URL, as an argument, and then go ahead. So it just says, okay, use this entry URL in the Internet Explorer and then go ahead. And what this will do, let's check it out. So here we have our program. Let me enter F, and that opens up Facebook. Now let me start the program again and see if it also opens up YouTube. So Y, and as you can see now, it opens up YouTube. And that is pretty much our software already. Now, of course, there are some minor tweaks that we still need to do because our program doesn't tell us if we enter something incorrectly. It just shuts down if we do. So let me just enter an incorrect value and nothing happens, right? So that's what we still need to cover. But with this approach here, you can pretty much open up any program. So here I just said, okay, Internet Explorer. If you want, you can, of course, enter the URL of Chrome and try that. But with the Internet Explorer, it definitely works. All right, so now what we need to do is to clean up our program because it works, but we don't have any tools to make sure that the user enters the correct value. So if he doesn't correct the right value, we want to give him another option or another try pretty much. And in order to do so, we can do the following. We can create a new Boolean. So here, bool found entry, which we're just going to set as false. This is going to be a helper variable, which just stores whether we found an entry or not. And in here, we're trying to find an entry. And if the entry doesn't exist, then we want to give the user the chance to enter something again. But if the entry does exist, so if we got to this code here, then found entry should be set to true. Now, if it doesn't exist, we want to check, okay, if found entry is equal to false, then run some code. And the code that I want to run is I want to give the user another chance. So I'm just gonna copy and paste my console write line code here. It's not too interesting for you probably to watch, but it just says, okay, can't find a valid entry, try again. And then the user can enter yes. If he does enter yes, he can enter once again. So let's get the choice of the user, console.readLine, and if the choice is equal to yes, or choice is equal to y, so these are the two options, right? So either you entered yes or y, then please go ahead and restart the app. So now we of course need to have some code which restarts the app. And in order to create this code, we can simply go ahead and create a new method for this. So let's create our restart app method. So we just use static void restart app, and restarting the app really just means to clean up our whole console and just go to the starting point. So restart the main method, because here we had the entries and we simply displayed the entries. So the only thing that we need to do here is to clear our console, and we can do that with the clear method that the console provides us. And this will clear the whole console. Now let's try this out here. Let's test this. In order to restart the app, we need to, of course, call the restart app method. Now let's run it again and let's enter something. Can't find the option or the entry. And if we say y, then you see the whole console is cleaned up. Now, if we want to restart the console with, or the main method with the whole code here that we see, we simply say main null. So we call the main method and we just give it null as the parameter. So now let's run it again and enter something. He says can't find a valid entry. If we just enter, the application closes. But if we enter yes, so your option, something, and yes, or y, you can see we go back. So this is what we get. So we can again enter, for example, F for Facebook and close our program. So we might want to restart our app in another option as well. So here we could say that once an entry was found, we could also restart our app. Okay, so let's say restart app in here. And then you already see the advantage of using methods, because now we have this restart app method, which we can simply reuse anytime where we see fit. So we need to use it at the point where the user says, okay, I want to restart my app, or we want to reuse it when the user has already opened up something, because otherwise we get stuck in this process and we would have to restart our program if we wanted to open up another tab. So let's try again. Now, what is our option? F for Facebook. And as you can see, it restarted. So now I can just enter G and it opens up Google. Or I can just enter Y and it opens up YouTube. All right, so that is pretty much our whole application, and it does everything that we wanted to do. Now there are some minor things that you might want to consider as well, because if I enter a capital G and I press enter, it says can't find valid entry, try again. Now that is something that some users might be unhappy about. Now if you want to make sure that it still works, what you can do is you can use this method called .toLower. So what this method does is it reduces the whatever key it was to a lower letter, to a lower character. Now we can do the same thing with the entry of the user, so with the user input. So now that's the beauty about C#. We can also just say, okay, toLower onto the read line that we had. So this read line returns a string, and onto strings we can apply this method called toLower, and this will just change the entry that the user is given into a lower capital letter. So just to show you that this is the case, I'm just going to add a console write line, user input is plus user input. So just so you see what's actually happening. Now your option, I'm just going to enter G, and well, we restarted the application. Let me enter something like this, and you can see even though the G was capital here, it changed it to Queg. Okay, now all caps now, and as you can see, your entry was and it's not kept, or it's not caps. Okay, so that's what this toLower does. So we need to lower the user input, and we can also lower the key, and while we're at it, also the name. All right, so now we can save the program and we're pretty much done. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this video. It's been a little longer than I expected, but that's how it is. I like to go a little more into depth about what's happening in the background, because I could just explain or just show you the code, but you're not going to learn anything from it, right? So my goal, of course, is to also show you a little more about what's going on in the background and why things are the way they are and so forth. So I hope you enjoyed it, and you can write your own little programs now. Of course, there's a lot to learn still, and yeah, if you want to learn more, of course, check out my courses.
I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then please leave a like. And if you have any questions or suggestions, then leave a comment. And of course, don't forget to subscribe. And by the way, if you really love the content and you would like to have more of it, or pretty much all of it, then of course, check out the link in the description to my whole course. See you in the next video.